to Fast Forward's webinar on how to become a better presenter and win over your audience. My name is Maria Zorzos, your moderator, and I'm very excited to have so many participants on the call today. We've all participated in presentation training during our career, and I promise you this session will be very different from what you've learned before. Embedded in the webinar invitation was a link to Fast Forward's presenter type survey. I hope you've all had a chance to complete it and retrieve your personal presenter type style guide. If you haven't completed the survey, go to makeapowerfulpoint.com following the webinar. You will understand why it's so important after the session. My presenter type is counselor. Through Gavin's coaching, I've learned to connect better with my audience by adding pictures and experiences to my decks and talk track. Have your results in front of you, as Gavin will be giving you insights into how to use your strengths to become a better presenter and how to use PowerPoint to complement and support your style. Before we begin, I'd like to take you through some housekeeping items. Please be sure to turn up the volume on your phone or PC so you can hear our speaker clearly. Also, we encourage you to ask questions during the webinar using the chat function. We will pause and address them throughout the session. This event is live and will be tweeting throughout the session at #PresentBetter. Today's session is also being recorded. We will make it available 24 hours post the event via email on our website, www.fastforward.com. Now on to today's speaker. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Gavin McMahon. He's the senior partner and co-founder at Fast Forward. Gavin is really passionate about helping people become better presenters. He launched our messaging and communication practice to help people and companies build better decks to support their presentation style. Gavin's developed our unique methodology from his own desire to become better on his feet, and by working with various levels and roles within organizations, including CEOs, consultants, heads of business units, salespeople, entrepreneurs, marketing, and design team. Gavin, over to you.
Thanks, Maria. Hopefully everyone can see the screen and the technology is working. I always start talking about this by mentioning the facts, and maybe it's a little strange, but it always feels weird to me to be talking about presenting because I'm very much like the person in the picture. I would much rather be in the audience listening to somebody than up there on stage actually presenting. But I think over the years I've managed to get better at it, and one of the reasons is I've really tried to figure out how to do this. The whole idea of presenting and getting better on your feet, I think all of you that are on this phone call, on this webinar, know instinctively that if I can do that better, I can get better at a lot of things I do, because it's a way to get your ideas out there. And being comfortable doing it is hugely important. We're going to spend about 45 minutes, and hopefully this will be as engaging as I can make it. Hold on. I've just got a note that says, hopefully there's the screen better. Hopefully everyone can see through that screen. What we're going to do is try and make this as engaging as possible. If there are any questions that we don't manage to cover during this, you can always tweet me at PowerPoint and use the hashtag @PresentBetter. So what I'd like to do today is really connect 3 dots. And the 3 dots are, I think, 3 really important questions when you think about this idea of presenting and getting better on your feet. The first is, who is it you're actually presenting to, and what's going to really move them? The second is what's in a good presentation? How do you know you've got the right component parts, the right elements to be able to do what you're doing? And then the last is, how can you actually be a better presenter, which I think is probably everyone is interested in that question. And there's always a way, I think, to improve. What I would say about this is it's not really rocket science. It's very practical, it's very useful. A lot of the ideas that we're going to talk about today are drawn from all sorts of disciplines, whether it's sociology or psychology, or it's just drawn from practical experience that we've had over the years in helping people either build presentations or keynotes, or actually helping them in the course of their work in terms of presenting. So we'll start off with that first question, and before we do that, let me ask you a question, because I think it's important for you to understand, and if you could just use the chat window, but think about when you give a presentation, whatever it is you typically do, why are you up there presenting? What's the reason for you? I think that's an important question to understand. Whatever your role is, whether you're an engineer or a marketer or you're in training, everyone has different reasons for being up there. So hopefully the chat window is working away, and if you could just begin to use it, because I'd like to make this as interactive as possible given the limits of the technology. But why are you guys presenting? So I'm beginning to see some answers like, I present a lot for training. I'm beginning to see answers around selling. I've seen my boss told me to, which I'm sure is always a reason for a lot of people. But let's take some of those and think about this, because I think in all the presentations that I've ever seen and all the conversations we've had about this, we really only see two reasons that people want to present. The first is that they want to frame or reframe the way people see the world. In other words, get on the same page. And the second is to move people to action. So what you're trying to do in a presentation is do these two things. And ideally, you want to be in the sweet spot of both of them, that you can get someone on the same page, get them to see the world the way you see the world, and move people to take that action. So that applies to something like selling. If you're selling, what you're trying to do is get people to understand that the product or service you're selling, they understand it the same way you do, and you want to move them to that next action, which might be, I'd like to close for the next meeting, or I'd like you to sign on the dotted line. Maybe you're doing some kind of business operations or operations review. What you'd probably like to do is to have your boss or whoever's doing the review see that the way you look at the business is a decent way to look at the business, and you've got your finger on the pulse, and maybe the action is some support that you're requesting in certain areas. But people are always doing these two things regardless of the type of presentation. And I think whenever they do anything else, and they do, all you're really doing is adding to the noise, because the only two worthwhile things doing in a presentation are framing and moving people to action. If you're just imparting information, if you're just getting up there because your boss told you to, if you're just filling time, you're really adding to the noise. And let's face it, we really don't need more noise in the world of Twitter, Facebook, and the thousands of emails people get. So the next question is, who are you presenting to? And I would say the answer is really simple. You're presenting to me. And I don't mean you are presenting to me, Gavin. I mean you're presenting to people who are very self-interested. That doesn't mean, I'm not admitting that I'm a closet narcissist, or I'm not saying that everyone on this call is a narcissist of some kind. What I am saying is that that self-interested conversation is probably our favorite conversation. You could think about it as the most important element for everyone. And so really, when you're presenting, even if you've got 1,000 people in the audience, they're all composed of 1,000 little me's. Even if you're talking to 2 or 3 people, it's 2 or 3 me's. They're not you. They're not interested in what you think. They're interested in themselves. So how do you crack the code on this idea of me, and how do you really begin to get through to me? I think there's 3 ways, and I'll carry on this theme of an element. But if me is the most important element, you can almost think about it like an atom, and what are the layers that you've got going on there. That first layer, the one that I think everyone on this call probably defaults to, is this logic. I have a rationale for whatever I'm doing. So I'm presenting a business case. In the middle of my business case, I have a return on investment, and that's the rational argument for why you should buy into my business case. Or maybe what you've got is you're selling something, so you're taking people logically through the features and benefits of whatever you're selling. Maybe you're training somebody, so you're taking somebody through the logical flow of whatever subject you're training on. Everyone defaults to logic, and I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not the only thing, and it's probably the most surfacey way of presenting. There's a second layer, because if you think about it, this idea that humans, we like logic because we think we're rational, but we're not. We're really great rationalizers. So putting logic in your presentation as a way to give people something to rationalize around is a very good idea. putting only logic in your presentation, expecting people to behave like Dr. Spock and thinking, or Mr. Spock, I'm going to get the right Spocks right, expecting them to behave like Mr. Spock and only work off a logical set of reasoning is not going to get you anywhere. You want to give people a reason to rationalize, but you've got to get to that deeper layer. And that begins with emotion. A lot of people will tell you about things around that the best way to get through to stuff is by thinking about the emotion. How do you pull on those emotional heartstrings? How do you think about how do you really appeal to people? And a lot of content marketers or marketers today will talk about storytelling, which is a great way to do it. Think about it like this. If you think about what happened at the end of last year, there was the fiscal cliff. Now, you could talk about the fiscal cliff, in a fairly emotionless, logical way and talk about it as a coming debt ceiling crisis, and that's, you know, or a debt ceiling problem or a debt ceiling issue, but it's not really scary sounding like a fiscal cliff. A cliff is something I could get near and I don't want to fall over. A ceiling is something I have over my head and it really doesn't make a difference because most of the ceilings that I know tend to stay up. So beginning to use emotional words, emotional language around how you present and what you're presenting around is really key. You can't just have this logical way of going through. There's a great quote, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, by a neurologist called Donald Kahn, and he's basically said emotion leads to action and reason leads to judgment. And every one of you on this phone probably know this, because if you've ever had an argument with your significant other or with someone else, you know that when it gets emotional, something's going to happen. Maybe good, maybe bad, but something will happen. And you know also if you have a reasoned argument about something where everyone remains dispassionate, all you'll get is a judge and jury on the other side. And Donald Kahn did some interesting research where he basically stuck people in an MRI machine and showed them pictures. When he showed the emotional pictures, the action centers of the brain lit up. When he showed the reason pictures, the logical arguments, the kind of legal briefs or things they had to read and think about, the judgment centers of the brain lit up. And going back to that original point I made about what you want people to do, framing the way they see the world and moving them to action, you will never move them to action if you don't have this argument. So that's the first layer is logic, the second layer is emotion. This third layer is probably the most crucial and the most difficult to move, and that's just the idea of self. I think most of the people on the phone know this man by name, Abraham Maslow, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They may never have seen a photograph of him. But really, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's you know, the two ends of the triangle. At the pointy end, it's hope, and at the base, it's fear. Your concern about safety and well-being and survival is at the bottom of the triangle, and this idea of self-fulfillment is really about hope. And the best arguments, the best presentations, the best way of you convincing people, moving people to action, framing the way they see the world, is to really play with hope and fear. And if you look at communicators that do it really well, they really can begin to do this stuff. An example, when the school shootings happened last year, and there's a huge outcry about gun control in the U.S. Basically, most of the country wanted to do something. If you looked at all the opinion polls, something was going to happen. And the NRA, who are great communicators, whether you like their politics or not, did a great job of working at all those three levels. They had a logical argument for what they wanted to do and the position they took. They had an emotional argument, and they really played on hope and fear. Hope and the language around Second Amendment rights and freedom, and this idea of fear that you know, if a villain has a gun, then you want to have a gun too. So if you look at any conversation or any argument or any presentation that really moves people, really frames or reframes the way they see the world, which is a very difficult thing to do, by the way, you have to play on all those three layers. One of my favorite examples is Winston Churchill in 1939. The British Army had virtually been wiped out in France. It had just been picked up, the remnants of it, on the beaches, and the Blitz was beginning. Britain was alone in the war, and he gave his famous we shall fight them on the beaches speech. We shall fight them on the landing grounds. And if you think about that speech, which a lot of people would say is one of the classic examples of public speaking of all time, of rhetoric, it really does touch all those three levels. Logic, it touches on emotion, and it certainly touches on pride and hope, and it certainly touched on fear. It's a tall order to do, but I think if you begin to think about your audience in that way, the me that you're getting through, and how do you get through to these things, that's the best way to start. And we use a very simple tool with our clients when we work with them. We tend to, as Maria said, we work with CEOs, we work with executives, we work with all sorts of different people, entrepreneurs who want to get something. This is an example, and it's been tidied up a little bit, but it really was the back of a napkin. All you need to do is put a line down a piece of paper. On the left-hand side, think about what you want, and on the right-hand side, think about that audience of me's. What do they want? And put a name on them if you can, or at least represent them as best you can. What we find when we speak to people is people have no problem filling out the left-hand column, and they have a really hard time filling out the right-hand column. This one was an example where someone had a bad business review the year before. They were releasing new products. They wanted to show that they were really doing well. They wanted to show that the engineering group really understood what was going on and how to track to this future. But he also had a very selfish goal in a way, this idea that I'm not just an engineer, but I could get promoted around here. It's all right being in that column, but if you don't figure out that the manager, the boss, or whoever it is you're presenting to isn't there, they have completely different goals. So you've got to track to their goals, looking where the missed revenue commitments come from, for instance. So that's the idea that you want to start when you think about me. I'll pause here for any questions on that. As we, Maria, I don't know if there's any questions come in so far.
Well, they're starting to come in, Gavin, but one has come in specifically asking, is there a different way to present based on my audience? For example, if I'm giving a keynote or an ops review, should I structure my presentation differently?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. The context of the presentation, I'm not really going to touch on it much today, but it is hugely important. The way you would structure and organize a presentation for 1,000 people in a keynote like South by Southwest versus the way you would do it in an ops review is very, very different. But it does cue off what the audience wants. I mean, you do have to start there. And then also, and we will get into this later, the type of presenter you are and what really works for you is also going to play a huge role in how you organize and build that presentation.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. Can you ask your audience or your boss what they want? Otherwise, how can you know for sure?
Well, I would say it depends on your relationship. I worked with someone last year who had a big conference up in, he was doing a conference up in Boston on data visualization, and asked for some help on how do I give a really good keynote, and we went through this process. He actually rang up the organizers of the conference, got the attendee list, found the job functions of the type of people that were going to attend, and then he knew some friends who were also data scientists and graphic designers and the types of people that were in this conference, and he said, if I was giving a speech on this topic, what would you really like to hear? And he did it that way. If you have the right relationship with your boss and you're giving a presentation to your boss and he says, you know, next Wednesday or a week from Wednesday, I want you to present on subject X, it's a really good idea to say, what is it that you really want me to cover? What's the outcome that you want to get from this presentation? Because otherwise, you go in doing what you think and you're off base, you will get derailed so quickly.
Great.
So yeah, even if you can't do that, I would always suggest at least you try and think in their shoes, even if you can't ask the question.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. Why don't we move on, and then we're going to track the questions, and if we have time at the end, we'll answer them. If not, we'll be posting them via our blog, Make a Powerful Point.
Okay. So what we did is we started with this question, who are you presenting to, and talked about this idea of me and this idea of making sure that you frame or reframe the way people see the world and move people to action. Question number 2 that really connects to this is, what is in a good presentation? And I'd ask you to think about this. And Jess, I'm not seeing some of the questions, so if you could retype them in the chat, some of the answers to this. But if you think about the presentations that you've seen, I know every one of you has seen something that you consider to be a great presentation, something you hold up there and say, maybe I wish I could do something like that. I wish I could give a presentation that good. And it may be a public figure. It may be someone that I would have no clue who it is. But you've seen good presentations. What's the best presentation you've ever seen? It may be a public speech. It may not be PowerPoint. It may be something different. But what have you seen that's a really good presentation? Just so you know, Jess, I'm not seeing the question window, so you'd have to reach out them in.
We're getting types of presentations, Gavin, like, for example, presentations that have relevant visuals that complement the speech,
Right.
Type of presentation that has humor, presentations that have powerful graphics that make complex things simple,
Right.
Steve Jobs' address at Stanford,
Right.
presenters who are able to speak directly to the audience.
It's interesting what people like, and one of the things I try to do with presentations is not just look at how people use PowerPoint, because I think you can learn lessons from anywhere. So let's look at people that are professionals at putting a message together, whether it's the people in the movie business, people in the TV business, people that write plays, books, advertising. All these people are professionals at doing what we said up front, framing the way you see the world. I mean, if you have a movie or a TV show, you're really creating a world for people to inhabit, not just the actors to inhabit, but the audience to inhabit. So you frame the way people see the world, and then you want to move them to action. You know, if you're the writer or producer of Justified, you certainly have an action in mind for the audience, even if it's only as simple as stay tuned in so you watch the advertising and tell somebody else, one of your friends, so the audience grows. There's an action in mind in the back there. And what's common amongst all these elements, movies, books, plays, whatever you think, they all have these same 3 common elements: words, pictures, structures. So, you know, one of you on the phone said powerful graphics, pictures. If you think about the movie business, we may not call it pictures. It may be called cinematography. It may be the special effects that make the pictures look fantastic. And certainly you wouldn't go along to Steven Spielberg and say the words in this movie are terrible. You might talk about the script is great or the script is terrible. There's a language that goes with each discipline, but they all deal with this idea of words, picture, structures. Even in books, a really good book, and this is one, will really tend to paint pictures in your mind. You'll almost live the experience as you hear the story. Advertising is the same way. Again, they're not called words, picture, or structures. The words are called copy. The pictures are called art. The structure is the layout. But these common elements, words, picture, and structures, are in every piece of human communication I've ever come across. And that's informative if you're doing a presentation, because if you don't have those elements and you haven't figured them out, you're not going to necessarily build a good presentation. So let's talk about words, picture, structures just a little bit and think about how does that work for your presentation. When I'm talking about words, I'm really talking about, obviously, what comes out of your mouth, the language, the phrasing, the story that you choose to use. It's hugely important, and it's, you know, if presentations were mimes, some of us would probably be a lot more comfortable about doing it, but at the end of the day, you have to speak. So choosing the right language, choosing language that is emotional, as I said before, that really inspires people and maybe has the right level of hope in what you want to do, is huge. What we tend to do, and what I think, one of my pet peeves, I think, in all presentations is when people use, my partner Rose likes to call it corporate pig Latin, which I think is such a lovely phrase, but the business bingo, the weasel words, all these kind of phrases like synergy and utilize, not only is it kind of pointless, it doesn't really make you seem any smarter. You can be a lot smarter if you can figure out a very simple way to tell your story, a very simple way to get it across. And the same happens when you have acronyms like ARPU and all sorts of different things, and every industry has a different point to that. The second one is pictures. So obviously you want to have graphics and visuals, charts, but what you're really trying to do is create an experience. It's surprising when you begin to look at it how much of an effect visuals or even font types or color choices have on someone. It's a choice that you have about, do you get dressed up when you go for an interview, or do you look like a schlub when you go for an interview? There's a subtle unconscious effect that happens to people whether we think this looks good. If it looks good, then maybe it's more truthful. It's a really weird association that people have, but it's actually what people think. You can influence people tremendously by the graphics and pictures you use. And conversely, you can influence people in the wrong way. I mean, if you just have a set of boring slides that just look boring and look confused, then maybe you look boring and you look confused, and that's never a good thing. And lastly, structure. This idea of logic, connections, and flow. I'm sure a lot of people on this phone, I have done it myself, I hate to admit it, but you've tried to open a door and pull it, and it's a push open door, even though it looks like you should be able to pull it. That happens all the time, that we have this mental model, or we have this way of thinking that this is the logical order of how I should go through things, but it doesn't connect with other people. You've got to think about, how do I structure this in a way that gets through it? And again, every discipline that you think about, play has 3 acts. Screenplays have a certain structure to them. Television shows have narrative arcs and season-long arcs. There's always a structure to good communication. And you really want to think about what's the structure that you're going to have as you begin to build this out. So the idea is, how do you get words, picture, and structure working together? Because you've got to pay attention to all 3, but you also have to have them working in sync. If you go and see a movie that looks fantastic and maybe the dialogue's okay, but it seems to be boring and doesn't go anywhere, maybe the structure's missing. If you're really not relating to an ad emotionally, maybe the words they're using are a little clinical. Yeah, and when it gets to things like PowerPoint, you can see this is just one slide. I always pick on government slides because they're freely available to talk about. But you can see that this is a pretty confusing picture. It's not so good there. The words are not that great, first of all because there's a lot of them, and then you have to work through. You're always looking at the notes and the small print to figure out what's really going on. And if you looked at the whole structure of this deck, it would look pretty confusing to you. So words, picture, structure, how do you get them in sync? How do you really get them to work for you is a key piece. The way I like to think about it is if you don't have words, picture, and structure in sync, it's almost like watching a bad Hong Kong action movie. You know, the lips are going, the dialogue is slightly out of sync with what's going on the picture. There's all sorts of explosions and fights and everything else, but you have no idea of what the plot is or what's really happening. And I've seen plenty of presentations that are like that, and I'm sure you have seen presentations that are like that, where something's just off, something is out of sync. And it's when words, picture, and structure are not working. So again, I'll pause there. Maria, I'm not sure if there are any questions about that section.
Yes, Gavin, we have a question. How easy is it for you to get your clients to use the emotional elements, for example, stories, phrases, pictures, in their presentation?
It's not, unfortunately. And I'll tell you why. I think this is the biggest problem we found with people presenting. It's 3 things: fear, time, and blindness. Like it or not, it's very scary when you have to present. You may have someone that's a senior level executive that seems very confident, but they know in the back of their head that every critical presentation is either career-defining or career-limiting piece. So people are very reluctant to go outside of their comfort zone. And in corporate America, I think unfortunately, we've learned to use these long words and unemotional language. I think people have to find ways where they can stretch slowly. So if you are working with a client, or if you are working with someone that that is willing to take the risk of doing something differently, and in other words, they're going to take on that fear, you've got to find the time to work with them, because just telling them the day before, you don't use this long word utilize, use word use. If it's unnatural, it will be unnatural because they've learned this other behavior. So it takes some time. I would pick your opportunities where people can practice and get comfortable.
Kevin, I'm going to save the rest of these questions for the end. I just want to make sure that we get through the next section.
Okay, so we talked about who you're presenting to, this idea of framing and reframing the way people see the world, moving people to action, and then these layers of logic, emotion, and self. Then we talked about what's in a good presentation, words, structure, and pictures. And now we get on to probably the most interesting bit. If I was right about me, we're now beginning to talk about me and how can you be a better presenter. So again, I'll just quickly ask this question. Who's the best presenter you've ever seen? And I'll take it for granted that someone's going to say Steve Jobs and someone else will say Barack Obama. It may be someone that you've worked with, but who are we getting in on the...
We're getting Martin Luther King, Justin Foster, Father Joseph Martin, Kevin Allen,
so
Johnny Carson.
Say again?
Johnny Carson.
Johnny Carson. Some people I know, some people I don't. I've heard of this Johnny Carson fella. I hear he's good. But what's interesting, what I think is very limiting about that question, and I ask it deliberately, is I think a lot of us get stuck because we look at somebody like a Steve Jobs or a Martin Luther King or maybe a Barack Obama or just maybe John, the CMO in my company, who happens to be very good, or Jane, the senior sales executive, who happens to be so charismatic, and you think, wow, I wish I could do that. And the unfortunate fact is, you're not John, and you're not Jane, and you're certainly not Steve Jobs. So you've got to figure out, how does this work for you? I'll tell you, I went through this struggle myself. The best presenter I've ever seen is my business partner, which is good for me and bad for me. And Rose is what we call a storyteller, and I'll talk about that more later. But you could literally put Rose on stage, and she could talk for 5 minutes or 55 minutes on anything. She generally talks about strategy and leadership, but you could wind her up and get her to talk about anything, and she'll have the audience eating out of the palm of her hand. That's great if she's your business partner and you're working with her. The only bad thing about that is if you have to go on after her. And so whereas I give Rose an A++ in presenting, I would give myself normally a C- in my natural state. And I think that's a result of my education, where we were just basically told to shut up and answer the questions, and there was no speaking in class, and we concentrated a little bit more on penmanship. I tell you that not because I necessarily want you to feel sorry for me, but it's okay if you do. I tell you more because, you know, that chasm between this person that goes on that lights up the stage, and then the person that goes on afterwards, who think, why have they got the AV guy up there talking to me afterwards, is really motivating. And that's really what I think precipitated why I ended up doing this, and why I have such a fascination with presenting, and why I really like to help people who really want to learn to get better. So I did what a lot of people normally do. I went to Dale Carnegie, and I know you can go to Toastmasters, a ton of different courses and ways of doing this. And I got told to stand up straight and not to jingle coins in my pocket. And I was told to scream like Tarzan. And if anyone that actually knows me would know that that's definitely not in my bag of tricks. I felt so uncomfortable. And I think while these people that give this kind of training are good, and they have some very solid practices. The unfortunate thing about it is most of the people that are train or give presentation training or help people with their presentations are the kind of people that would be in amateur repertory theater anyway. They like to be on stage. And if you're an extrovert dealing with an introvert, it's very difficult to figure out what it is that really pushes the introvert's buttons and why it is they won't do it. And generally the solution is just put them in a very uncomfortable situation until they get used to it. And I don't think that's the best way. And it really occurred to me that there's a different way of doing it. It was about 7 or 8 years ago when Stephen Colbert first aired. And he had this segment called The Word, and I'm assuming a few people have seen it. But it's basically a satire of Bill O'Reilly. So Stephen Colbert is there speaking seriously to camera, and these bullet points are popping up next to him. And while Stephen Colbert is serious, the bullet points are being funny. Even though he's a very funny person, he was being serious in that segment. And then it just dawned on me, you know, why am I trying to do all the things I can't do? Why can't I just get PowerPoint to do the things I don't do? And that led to this path of thinking out the presenter types and how they really work. Because it goes back to this idea of words, pictures, structures, and how do I put them together? We did this survey, and hopefully lots of you have taken the survey about what type of presenter are you, and I'll just go through those. There are 6 types: storyteller, counselor, coach, teacher, producer, and inventor. And most of the people on this call are counselors. We have only about 10% of storytellers and very few are coaches, but I'll go through each type. The storyteller, about 10% of you on the phone, you really are very eloquent, and you are naturally good at getting up and presenting. In a group, in a small group setting, if someone has to volunteer to present, you would be the one that would get volunteered or volunteer normally. And storytellers paint pictures with their words. They can be a little unstructured, so their order is words, pictures, structures, and you can see they can be a little loose on the way they structure, but in their natural state, they speak with a lot of feeling and rhythm. They engage audiences very easily, and the way they embellish and emphasize is through story and talking about experiences. Where they can go a little wrong is they can, as it looks here, they can be a little unstructured. So you can be a storyteller but be a little all over the map. A counselor is also a very, again, a lot of people on this call, nearly 30% of the people on this call are counselors. They're people that are naturally very gifted verbally. They're people, again, that wouldn't have a problem and wouldn't be uncomfortable getting up and speaking. And they, you can see it goes words, structure, pictures. They speak to structure. So you'll hear a counselor say, look, I've got, and Barack Obama is a good example, look, I'm going to make 3 points. Point number 1, point number 2, point number 3. They speak to structure. Where they can tend to go wrong is in pictures. They're not really painting pictures with their words. It's not that they can't get there. I mean, certainly Barack Obama can, when he gets into soaring oratory mode, he really can hold an audience in the palm of his hand. But the knock on him as a public speaker is he can be very professorial. He can just dictate and tell people. Not that he's not clear, but he can sound academic. And that's where counselors can go wrong as well. They can seem a little dry and dusty. So they speak in a very structured way. You speak in a very structured way. You talk about ideas, and you like to talk ideas. You're very accurate for those counselors on the phone, very organized talk track, this relentless stream of logic. And you can move very easily between the big picture and the detail. And that's a really great skill. Again, the engagement side of things, the painting a picture, creating an experience, that can be a little light for a counselor. So I'm going to go through each of these two at a time. Are there any questions that I have for anyone that came out as a storyteller or a counselor? Oh, I've got a question. I got coordinator, that wasn't listed. We've actually changed the word coordinator to producer, and the reason we did that is we've done these workshops now with about 2,000 people, and people that were getting the label coordinator didn't like it because they felt it was a little pejorative. And producer is a similar one. We'll talk more about that there. Are there any questions about the storyteller or the counselor?
No other
Maria?
questions, Gavin. No other questions.
Okay. So very few of us on the people on this call, about 7% are coaches. So for the 1 or 2 of you on this call, your order is pictures, words, structure. You can tell a coach, I saw someone, he was a regional vice president of a very large company, and he had a big town hall meeting, and he was walking up and down behind the stage, mumbling to himself, looking up, and with a piece of paper in his hand, thinking about what he was going to say, and he was trying to commit it to memory by walking and talking. And the coaches are really energetic. They're very personable speakers. They're great at connecting and engaging, and they're very passionate about their topic if they let it shine through. Again, like storytellers, they can be a little all over the place. They can be unstructured and difficult to follow, but they can really get somebody going. You can imagine how a football coach is. They're very much like that style of public speaking. A teacher is more similar to a counselor. They're very structured, and they, instead of speaking to structure, I like to think of them as speaking around structure. So they'll start with structure, then go to words, then go to pictures, and they can easily get very complex ideas across. A lot of people on this call are teachers, about 15% of you. You easily get complex ideas across. You use a lot of figures and speech and metaphors to get that across, but very well structured. And the great thing about teachers is they can carry a very long talk track in their heads. It makes some of the rest of us jealous. But again, that pictures, a teacher will speak just as well to an empty room as they will to a room of 1,000 people, because naturally their audience engagement and how they engage the audience isn't that important to them. But the structure of their content and how they speak around their content is huge to them. Any questions on that, Maria, or shall I just move on?
I would say move on.
Okay. Last 2 types, and then I'll talk a little bit about some tips and tricks to get better. The producer, which AKA the coordinator. So if you've got coordinator on the survey, we've retitled it to be producer. These last 2 types are the people that are like me, that would rather be in the audience than up on stage. They're very structured and organized. They think about the experiences they want to create, but words are a little difficult. They can pull off very thorough, well-structured presentations. You'll see a producer will like to move and gesture. And the slides, you can tell, because they're very meticulous and well-organized slides. The downfall is, same as an inventor coming up next, they will tend to, because they're worried about the words, they'll tend to put a lot of stuff on the slide, and in the worst case, tend to start reading those slides because they worry. Producer and an inventor, like myself, we both have this problem with words, which is, like I said before, if you're a mime, it's okay, but if you're a presenter, it's a problem. So this idea about how do I deal with words, the worst thing is you have this conversation with somebody, or you have this presentation, or you have some kind of dialogue, and you think about the right thing to say, but you just think about it 24 hours later. It feels like it's always on the tip of your tongue and you can't get there. So the worst advice is to say, if ever you hear if you're a producer or an inventor and someone ever says to you, say it like that, just say it exactly like that, you should ignore that advice immediately. Because it'll cause you to freeze up, it'll cause you to just think about, well, what is it I want to say, and you're searching for those words. So an inventor is someone that's very good at connecting ideas. They build logical sequences. They think about the experiences and structure those experiences for people, and use a lot of visuals and pictures. They're much more comfortable in Q&A, and they are desperate to prepare their own deck, because they're really, that act of preparation is really their act of rehearsal, about how they do it. You ask anyone that I work with, I would much rather make my own decks than have someone else do it, because I don't like somebody giving me content, because then I have to think about how's it organized, how it's structured, how does it work. So those are the 6 types. If there's no questions on that, I'll just pause for a second, and then I'll talk a little bit about what you can do with them.
So Gavin, just a comment. Is there any connection between the 6 types to introversion or extroversion?
We haven't done enough research to find that out. It's an interesting question. We're just beginning to talk to some business partners to see if we can do it. I would suspect that producers and inventors are more introverted, but I can't say that for definite.
Okay, and then we have a comment that in presentation training, it seems like most trainers try to make everyone present like a storyteller.
Yeah. I think that's a bad idea, and I'll tell you why. In fact, I'll go on to this. It's going back to my Stephen Colbert example. You know, get PowerPoint to do. People are going to be at their best when they are themselves. They're going to be at their worst when they're pretending to be someone else, because most of us are not trained actors. And I think in a 1 or 2 day presentation class, you can't learn to be a trained actor. So you have to figure out, how do I do my best self? And this comes back to Stephen Colbert and this idea that PowerPoint should do the thing that you don't do. Think about you and PowerPoint as a double act. Think about how you get PowerPoint to do the thing you don't do. So if you don't remember the words very well, then how can I get PowerPoint to help me remember the words without turning into a teleprompter? If I'm a little all over the map, how can I get PowerPoint to structure what I'm saying really for the benefit of the audience more than anything else, so they can follow what I'm saying? I may be engaging them moment to moment, but I want them to follow. If I tend to be a little dry and dusty, how do I get PowerPoint to be a little bit more passionate because I'm not going to be, or a little bit more funny because I'm not funny? I think you can do that, and I think that's the art of really skillful presentation, is understanding who you are and getting, and I say PowerPoint in a generic way. You could be talking about Prezi, you could be talking about a whiteboard. It really doesn't matter. Whatever's in the room with you, how do you get that to do the things that you don't do? So if you're missing structure, which, if you remember, this is for the coaches and the storytellers, I think there's 3 simple things that I would tell you. One is get in front of a map. If you can present in front of a big picture, if you've got the right size of room, and you can, and it really is constructed like a map or a mural of some kind, or something like Prezi is also a good tool for this. You can actually show your structure, and you can wander around all over the map, but because the audience can see it, you can follow it. And you can get PowerPoint to behave like a map too. It's not that difficult. Another thing, and I've seen president of a very large company do this exceptionally well. It's funny how people pick up these little habits over a lifetime, but it's not till you're just about to retire that you've mastered it. He will have this very engaging dialogue, and he'll use a flip chart all the time. And the scribble on the flip chart is horrendous. You can't really read what he's writing. But the act of him structuring as he's going helps the audience follow along and helps really people engage. And the third trick for all the, I would say, the storytellers and coaches out there is to tell your structure. So Lawrence Lessig, who's one of the highest rated speakers on TED, does this really well. He'll say something like, I'm going to tell you 3 stories on the way to an argument. So he's told you, I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and I'm going to use those 3 stories to make an argument. By him telling you the structure, he's keeping himself honest and keeping himself doing that. That's for the storytellers and coaches. For the counselors and for the teachers who are missing pictures, and pictures is about not just the literal pictures that you see in the middle of this, the 104 chemical elements in the universe. It's really about the experience and the visuals that you create in people's heads. And you can do that multiple ways. The first, you can actually ask questions. Actually ask people to draw on their own experiences. That question might be rhetorical. You might actually ask the question in an audience. But if you can do that, that will actually begin to engage. The third is to use very rich, very visual PowerPoint. Use rich pictures, use provocative pictures, use pictures that are humorous. If you can do that, you can begin to engage. And again, it's not you being funny, it's PowerPoint being funny. It was a very dry subject. He's actually very funny, but the way he does funny is he uses a lot of, he brings in a lot of pop culture references and cartoons, and they're on the PowerPoint. But he's not telling any jokes, but he keeps it light, and he keeps potentially a very dull subject very engaging. Then this third point, this third idea, is to add what I call verbal seasoning. Verbal seasoning is just a very content-free, content-light thing. You come to a list of bullets and you just happen to say that this third point is my favorite. It doesn't mean anything to the audience. Why would they care that bullet 3 is your favorite? But it makes you seem human, and I think that's one of the things that you need to approach. Lastly, if you're missing words, and these are the producers and the inventors, first of all, don't even try to remember stuff. If everyone says, say it like that, don't. If you really need to remember it, put it on the slide. If it's a big quote, put it on the slide. And then it's really simple. You just have this routine of click, comment, connect. You click, you look at the slide, you say something, and you connect it to a previous comment you've made, to somebody in the audience if you're in a small enough group. Click, comment, connect. And transitions and animations in PowerPoint are your friend because they'll step you through and you don't have to remember anything. It's like building a series, making the slides into a series of stepping stones, so you take away the worry of, oh, what am I going to say next? You just click and look at it. And telltales are this idea that I could look at a period or a bullet point or a little picture, and that reminds me to say something. The audience may never even see it, but it reminds me. So you've got these three things. We've talked about these three questions, and I would say thanks everyone for staying on the webinar and listening. Who are you presenting to? What's in a good presentation? How can you be a better presenter? When we talked about who you're presenting to, remember you're presenting to me, and think about these layers of logic, emotion, and self. When you think about what's in a good presentation, think about words, picture, structures, and how am I going to use words, picture, structure to be a better presenter. And then if you understand your presenter type, and if you haven't taken the survey, please do, whether you're a storyteller, an inventor, a counselor, whatever you are, think about the things you don't do well, and think about you and PowerPoint being that double act, because that's the thing that will really unlock it. It will save you so many sleepless nights as you begin to get much more comfortable using that kind of system. I think that's it. Is there any other, I don't know if there's any questions. I'm happy to take them.
We actually, Gavin, if you have time for maybe 2 short questions, and then we'll do a quick summary. Also, the audience has increased your GPA. You've moved up from a C- to an A+.
That's very kind.
I wanted to throw that one in before some of the people left.
Now I'm going to have to lose a slide. That's terrible.
So we have a question. Can someone move from being an inventor to a storyteller during the presentation as they become more comfortable?
Okay, so I would say if there's any psychologists on the line, I would tell you that I've mislabeled types because what they really are traits. I think these things exist on a spectrum. So I think people have a center of gravity around these things. They tend towards one more than the other. And then the other thing I see is that as people begin to get better and more comfortable in speaking, and they pick up the tips and techniques that begin to work for them, they can really take on some of those things. But I'm not a storyteller. I never will be. I can learn how to be much more emotional and tell stories as an inventor. But I don't think people really change. They are what they are. And I don't know why you'd want to be honest.
One more question, Gavin, regarding having to prepare presentations for other people. So if you have a large group of people that you prepare presentations for, I mean, how do you go about doing that? Does that affect your work process?
It's huge. We use this. We have a studio and we prepare decks for our clients. We'll build keynote presentations. We'll build infographics. We'll build any kind of presentation. We use this idea of, it's very important for us to understand who we're dealing with. I'll tell you a quick story. So very senior executive has a board meeting 4 times a year. The typical way they do the board meeting is, we'll call him Joe. Joe calls some of the people that work for him in, and Joe basically says, I would like to do X, Y, Z in the board meeting, and he goes through it for about 15 minutes, and then they go away. The people that are working on this really slave away on building the right deck, doing all the research, putting all the stuff together for the board meeting. They come back with something, and Joe basically throws up all over them. No, that's not what I want. I want to do A, B, C together with X, Y, Z. And what's happening, and it really broke the code for them when we talked about it, is that he was a storyteller. And storytellers, they have a different way of practicing. The way they practice is they will practice snatches of conversation. And so what Joe was doing is every time he was throwing the people out of his room and saying, no, this isn't right, go and do it again, he was really practicing how he was going to say it to the board, because he was saying, I want it to be like this. And every time he was getting a little bit more sophisticated with the message. So if you understand how people prepare and practice, you will completely change how you build presentations to people. You'll also completely change how you build presentations because you'll understand how they can be their best selves when they're on their feet.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. We are getting a lot of comments regarding people trying to take the survey, so just a quick announcement. If you're trying to take the survey, please make sure that you're using Chrome or Safari. I think that's it for questions, Gavin. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone found the webinar informative. If you'd like to learn more about how to build a message strategy, how to build customized presentations, or if you need any help with studio services, you can tweet Gavin at Powerful Point or contact us through our website. So thanks, everyone, for participating today, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going with you.
Thank you.